hour talking about your organization, what your policies and procedures are, how they're going to be helping you, and how their service to your organization affects and impacts your community. After you've trained them, you might want them to come back. Hopefully, if they've done a good enough job as a volunteer, you're going to want to have them come back a lot more. So retention is a very important part of volunteer management. And we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies for retention and some tips and things to keep in mind as you're working with volunteers and making sure that they keep coming back because they love working with your organization and they can see that the impact that they're making is positive. After you've had your volunteers serving for a little while, you might want to see that you're recognizing them in some way to make them feel appreciated. We're going to talk a little bit about different strategies for volunteer recognition. After you've recognized your volunteers, they've been trained, they're coming back, everything is hopefully flowing smoothly for you. You might want to evaluate your volunteers. You might also want to evaluate your volunteer program as a whole, see if you're doing a good job with having your volunteers serve the community, if your volunteers are happy, and making sure that you're also accomplishing the mission of your organization through your volunteers, evaluating all of that, and then taking the feedback that you get, the things that you find out, and then restarting the whole cycle again, because this isn't a straight line, it's a big old circle. So, don't think I have control over advancing the slides. So if someone would like to do that for me.
Bridget, are we on the right slide for you?
I think my computer is being a little wonky.
Okay.
But I can go ahead and continue on my end.
It should be the let's review some volunteer basics slide, correct?
Yep, okay. It's showing up now.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how familiar you guys as members are with the term relationship management, but volunteer management is all about relationship management. Relationship management is a lot of focus on meeting people where they're at and then building a relationship up from that meeting point so that it's a mutually beneficial relationship between them as a volunteer or as a community partner or as a community resident and your organization that's trying to positively impact the community. The better and stronger that relationship is, the better and stronger the impact is going to be on the community from your organization. So when you're thinking in terms of volunteer management within relationship management, you're going to be recruiting volunteers where they're at. Depending on the kind of work that you're doing in the community will probably depend on where you're recruiting your volunteers from. If you're doing a literacy program, you're probably not going to be recruiting people from like high school necessarily, who are still like learning how to be a mentor, how to do all of that kind of stuff. You might be recruiting some people who have a little bit more skills or who have gone through literacy programs themselves and kind of know where all of that is coming from, have gotten the skills to teach other people. You're not going to necessarily be recruiting very unskilled basic volunteers. If you're recruiting people for just one-day activities and it's a lot of physical activities, you're probably going to be looking at recruiting some high-energy folks. But it's very important to recruit volunteers where they're at and not where you hope that they're going to be, because it might not be very fruitful to do that. There might not be a whole lot of volunteers where you want them to be. And especially when you're working with underserved communities, you're probably going to be finding a lot of folks who are in situations that you're already trying to serve. And recruiting volunteers from those communities and those populations to continue to serve those populations is a very valuable tool to making sure that you're actually accomplishing your mission and working with the community rather than working at the community. When you're recruiting volunteers, make sure that you're appealing to their interests and skills so that they're actually doing a job that they want to do if they're not doing something that they want to do or something that they feel confident in, they're probably not going to come back. They're probably not going to do a very good job in the first place. So making sure that you, when you are recruiting your volunteers and you're training your volunteers, make sure that you are actually putting them somewhere where they are comfortable or where they have a skill or where you are able to teach them that skill in a fairly complete manner. Speaking of recruitment, when you're recruiting a volunteer, ask what they would like to do or what they would be most comfortable doing. If you already have a menu of choices available, that is perfect. If you have a volunteer application where they can check off, yes, I would be comfortable doing social media. I would be comfortable doing helping out with a workshop. I would be comfortable doing outside activities. So you already have that background knowledge on them, and then you can use those skills and preferences to good use, and then kind of build up that relationship with them, because then you're not putting them somewhere where they really don't want to be for the day. In habitat world, if you are not comfortable using a power tool, you're probably not going to be put on power tool duty for the day unless you've been trained, because not only is that a volunteer retention, the volunteer management thing, that's also a safety thing. If you're trying to use a power saw and you don't know what you're doing, you could cut off a thumb, and then that's just no good for anyone. After you've recruited your volunteers, part of the relationship management thing is engaging them and continuing to engage them after you recruited them and after they've started to volunteer. You're building that relationship up. You're continuing to be in contact with them, letting them know what you need as an organization, and then also fitting in what they need, whether it's an experience, whether it's service hours, whether it's some sort of visual or direct impact on the community that they live in. If you continue to engage your volunteers and you continue to build that relationship up, that is very important, because then they can see with your organization that everything that you're doing is making a positive impact. They're going to feel better about your organization. They're probably going to be more likely to come back and volunteer with you, and they're probably going to be more likely to talk up your organization to their friends and family and people that they relate with, and then you might have some more volunteers from that as well. Next slide, please. So when you're talking about recruitment and you're talking about training, one of the things that you'd want to make sure is that you have a clear idea of what you want your volunteers to do. Making up a position description can be very helpful, not only to you, but also to the volunteer. Then that way you have a clear idea of what exactly this position is supposed to be doing, whether it's a fairly simple position, just helping out with office work, doing filing, stuffing envelopes, running copies. That can be a very easy volunteer for someone who is very focused on being organized or very focused on getting some basic office skills, maybe re-entering the workforce. Or if it's a little bit more in-depth, like a volunteer internship or a long-term volunteer position, if you have a volunteer position description written out, then you as the organization or the representative of the organization or the person who is managing the volunteer has a clear idea of what that position is set out to accomplish, and passing that along to the volunteer also gives them a clear line of what they are and are not expected to do. If you're not the one who is supervising or recruiting a volunteer for a specific position or a specific task, communication is key. Communicating your needs for the volunteer, whether that's when they're actually in the office or on site with you, or communicating needs for the type of person that you're looking for, are very important to make sure that it's a good fit. And then communicating timelines as clearly as possible. If you have an event that's coming up in 2 weeks and you need 5 people to come and help set up, letting the person who's recruiting the volunteer know that a few weeks in advance rather than 2 days before is going to be very helpful to everyone involved, so that no one is scrambling at the last minute and you can actually get quality people that will help you accomplish the task at hand rather than just warm bodies who may or may not be actually helpful on the day of. Volunteers work best when they see immediate results or they understand why the work is necessary. And especially with VISTA, I'm sure that if you haven't found out already, you may soon, that sometimes indirect work may not be as satisfying as you'd like to be. It sometimes feels a little disheartening to be behind the desk or behind the scenes, not serving directly with the community, but rather setting a lot of things in place so that change can be impacted in the future and not necessarily immediately. But especially with Vista, you can see the mission at work. You can see maybe not a direct impact with a person moving into a house or them being able to read a chapter book or them getting a job right off the bat, but you can see how your work is directly impacting the community because you can see in your results, maybe a little bit later on in the year, that X amount of people have been able to get jobs, or because you've written an operating or a procedure manual for the stuff that you're doing, you're taking that into your organization, and then their policies and procedures are better flowing, and they can serve more people at a time. Letting a volunteer know how they've impacted your organization, even if it's behind the scenes work, kind of like what you're doing, is very important to their satisfaction as a volunteer, but also just a clarification of impact for your organization. When I was serving as a VISTA in North Carolina for one of my service sites, we went out on a service trip to South Carolina, and we did some work with an organization that did shoreline restoration so that there wouldn't be as much erosion. So we got to see a direct impact of being able to plant seagrasses and planting bags of oysters so that more soil would be retained, more sand would be retained, and nothing would erode. But it was kind of like, hooray, we kind of did this thing, but what does it really matter? The group went back the next year, and they were able to show us pictures of the impact of the work that we had done the year before, and they could say, because of your work, we gained X amount of square feet of shoreline in this past year just because of the 2 hours that you put in for us. And that 2 hours that your group of 12 people put in saved us 3 weeks of doing the work ourselves. So obviously you guys aren't necessarily doing shoreline restoration or anything like that, but if you have an event coming up and you're stuffing envelopes, or if you were putting on a workshop and trying to impact a whole large group at the same time rather than one-on-one, you can let your volunteers know that they've saved you 2 weeks because they came in and did 5 hours of work. You can let them know that because you've done a workshop and you recruited 20 people to do resume editing or interview skills or literacy skills, you've saved your staff 3 weeks of one-on-one time trying to reach as many people. So letting them know the why of what they're doing was a real good motivator in order to make your volunteers really appreciate your mission, even if it's not as direct of an impact as they might want to see. Next slide, please. So when you're working with your volunteers, recognition and evaluation is fairly important. Whether that's a formal or informal recognition or evaluation, there's not necessarily a wrong way to do it. Do it in a way that works for you. If it's an informal volunteer breakfast that you're just having them stop in for donuts and coffee, that can really be touching because then you get 5 minutes maybe of one-on-one time to talk with the volunteer, shake their hand, tell them something about their service that you've really appreciated, and then they go home and they have a great rest of their day because they know that they were appreciated, and they know specifically why. And it doesn't have to be a very big production. Similarly with volunteer evaluation, it doesn't have to be a big production. You can do something on maybe a quarterly basis or a yearly basis of asking your volunteers if you're doing a good job, if you're addressing the needs that they see in the community, if there needs to be more or less communication. It doesn't have to be a 20-page survey. It can be a half a page of questions that maybe you go along with them as they do their yearly volunteer waiver signing. You can combine a bunch of these things, have them come in for an ice cream social once a year, have them all sign volunteer waivers that you can keep on file, and then ask them if there's anything that you could be improving. Ask them what you're doing really great already. So when you're doing your recognition and your evaluation, pay attention to the needs and the wants of your volunteers, though. In Habitat Land, we have a lot of older folks who are not really in it for the recognition. They're in it because they want to serve their communities, and they're retired, and this is just kind of something that they keep on doing. It's their social outlet. They don't necessarily want to go up on stage and receive a big award for it. That's perfectly fine. A handshake and a cup of coffee every morning when they come in is recognition enough for them. But you might have some people who would really appreciate going up on stage and having a fancy award that they can put on their desk at home and display to all their friends. There's no wrong way to do that. So if you have some folks who are a little bit more introverted or not wanting to be in the public eye that way, don't make them go up on stage. But if you do have someone who is motivated by that kind of tangible recognition, don't just give them a cup of coffee and a handshake every morning and expect them to be very warm and fuzzy to you. I mean, they're still going to appreciate your organization, but sometimes you need to build that relationship up and really focus on what works for different volunteers. And that might take a lot of work on your part, getting to know the volunteers and working with them one-on-one and talking with them one-on-one, but it will be worth it to your service and to your organization's impact. If you are doing evaluation and a lot of your volunteers don't have access to the internet or are not very computer savvy, don't put a survey up on SurveyMonkey because you won't get a whole lot of return on your investment in that survey. If you have folks who are kind of intermittent or are better suited to doing just a 5-question survey really quick, print out some half-page surveys, make the survey really easy, like yes or no questions or a scale of agree to don't agree. Make it very simple for them to give you the answers that you're looking for or the type of information that you're looking for. If you're working with a team at your host site to work with your volunteers, involve them in recognition and evaluation as well, because the work that your volunteers do for your organization affects your entire organization at some point. It's not just you in a vacuum or you in a silo working with volunteers. The work that your volunteers do, whether or not you're recruiting them or whether or not you're supervising them, especially impacts your whole organization and involves your whole organization. Especially as a VISTA, you're not going to be there for the next forever. Your service is intentionally temporary. So if you're involving the rest of your staff or the rest of your team at your host site in the evaluation and recognition of volunteers, that also makes that recognition and evaluation and those relationships with your volunteers more sustainable. So when we're working with volunteers, you want to make sure that you're getting your paperwork in line. Make sure that your volunteer waivers and background checks are kept in a file folder for all of your volunteers. State standards in the state of Michigan mandate that volunteer waivers and background checks should be kept on file for at least 3 years after the volunteer leaves your organization. You might not be the one in charge of doing any of that, but that is still something that you should kind of have in the back of your head. Volunteer waivers need to be signed every year. Background checks, once that volunteer has come in and volunteered and done their background check, then that's fine as long as nothing has happened with the volunteer's legal history. Background checks aren't necessary for all volunteers necessarily. That's something to maybe discuss with your host site and your policies and procedures for volunteers. Usually, if they're working with a vulnerable population, so children, the elderly, low-income populations, folks who are disabled or in some way or some other categories, Those are probably going to be vulnerable population qualifiers, and if you have volunteers working one-on-one with them or in a group setting, those volunteers will probably need to have clearance. You probably will not be the ones doing background checks on them because that might not be your role at the organization, but it's still going to be necessary to have them done. Your organization should have some sort of volunteer liability insurance or volunteer liability coverage to go over your volunteers in case something happens. That is, again, not necessarily your job to make sure that they have, but just checking in with your site to make sure that there are policies around that would probably be helpful to you knowing how your organization runs, but also just making sure that everything is in place. Your organization probably should have some sort of volunteer policies or a volunteer handbook, whether it's an internal thing that your organization just uses for staff or a handbook that you can hand out to volunteers so that if they're more of a recurring volunteer or more of a long-term volunteer, they know all of the ins and outs of volunteering with your organization. Records for all of your volunteers, including those waivers and background checks, and then contact information and volunteer history are very, very valuable to have, especially if you're the one recruiting or maintaining those relationships. You can pass that information along to the person who is going to be sustaining that after your service ends so that that relationship can continue. And when I say things like volunteer history, that can be notes about their birthday is such and such a date, send them a card, or they prefer not to work with this person because they don't get along, they had a falling out. It doesn't matter what the falling out was, but just knowing that they prefer to not be scheduled with this person or at this time because they have kids or they have a family that they have to take care of. Little notes like that really help with maintaining relationships and making sure that your volunteers are happy and able to come back and serve with your organization. Next slide. We're running a little quick on time, so if you have any other best practices or tips for managing volunteers, go ahead and share them in the chat box for your fellow VISTA members to read. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about getting creative with recruitment. So high school students and college students are probably going to be looking at resume builders. So I'm sure that a lot of you probably have experience with building a resume or needing something to put on your resume. Regular volunteer work, especially a little bit more intensive work that they can relate to their course of study, will not only help your host site, but also is going to be very beneficial for their own professional experience. When I first became a VISTA back in ye olde days of 2008, I'd never really worked in an office before. So it was very helpful that my site supervisor was patient with me in learning basics of office culture, like how to use one of those giant copy machines, how to use a fax machine, the courtesy of refilling the coffee pot or not leaving your stuff in the fridge to rot over months and months and months because you forgot about it. So that kind of professional experience is very valuable to folks who are just starting out in office culture. And if you can start them out early as a high school volunteer or a college volunteer, they're going to be better prepared to enter that kind of career path if that is in fact their career path. And if they can relate it back to their course of study or if they can relate it back to their own interests, they're going to have an even better time of it because that's something that they can promote even more on their own resume. A lot of high schools and colleges now have service requirements, whether it's a requirement for a service learning course or a specific club or like National Honor Society or Key Club or Kiwanis that have service requirements so that they have to perform X amount of service hours in the community in order to maintain their membership or in order to pass the class. Take advantage of those opportunities. Recruit those volunteers. Talk to those groups about coming in to do projects with you because you have a built-in group of people who are ready and willing to come in and volunteer, and you don't have to do a whole lot of extra work to get them in. They're ready to go. You just have to tell them what to do. If your host site can offer internships, that is fantastic. Doesn't necessarily have to be paid as much as most people would like to be able to pay their interns, and interns would like to be paid. If a student does really well with regular volunteer tasks, like the simple stuff, filing folders, stuffing envelopes, maybe doing a little bit of one-on-one work or outreach work, this can be a real incentive to be offered an internship to take that next step up with your organization and giving them a little bit more formal responsibilities or more difficult tasks that they can step into that are a little bit more challenging. If you can offer other incentives, maybe not quite an internship, but other incentives to get your volunteers in and make them happy. And it's not necessarily all about making your volunteers happy, but it does really help. If you can give them free food, I mean, I'm in my 30s and I still go to stuff for free food because then that's dinner that I don't have to make, or that's lunch that I don't have to worry about, or it's a breakfast that I don't have to worry about. If you can offer free food for day-long projects, especially breakfast snacks or a donated lunch, that's a really great incentive for groups because then they don't have to do the planning on their end. Even if it's just treating your volunteers to snacks or lunch on occasion, that's really great for retention. In Habitat Land, I reference that a lot because that's what I'm most familiar with right now. A lot of Habitat sites will provide granola bars and water or coffee and hot cocoa on cold days just to make sure that the volunteers feel welcome to the build site, but also as a safety thing, if you're coming in and you're not hydrated, or if you're coming in and you work yourself really hard but you haven't really had a whole lot of food to eat, a granola bar will give you a little bit of protein or give you a little bit of extra blood sugar so that you're not passing out on the work site, because that's, again, a safety issue. So just the little things can make your volunteers feel so appreciated and so welcome and so loved by your organization that they're going to want to come back. They're going to want to tell all of your friends and family that you guys gave them pizza for a day-long project and it was amazing and they love you, and they're going to come back and they might donate to you. Who knows? It's a relationship that you're building. If you can give away like t-shirts or other swag that's branded with your host site's logo, that's not only a great gift to your volunteers, but it's also a marketing and outreach opportunity. One of the Habitat sites that I've worked with in the past, they were having a lot of problems recruiting folks for the winter because who wants to go out and do construction in the middle of January? So they worked with a couple of local corporate sponsors and got different levels of swag branded with their logo. It started out, if you came out and worked on the build site for one day, you got an ice scraper with their logo on it. So every time you were in your car or you gave it to a friend, every time that they looked at it, you saw the Habitat logo for that site and you're reminded of why you got that thing in the first place. It kind of went up from there. I think you got a hat for doing 8 or 10 hours. You got something else for doing more hours. I think if you went up to 60 hours during the winter, you got a fleece moose jaw jacket that was branded with their logo. And first of all, like, I don't have a moose jaw jacket, but that's a really nice jacket from what I've heard. And then you get it for free for volunteering. So you are nice and cozy warm. You've got your Habitat branded swag out there in the community. People are going to wonder where you got that from and what it took to get it. So if your volunteer feels nice and cozy warm, they're going to feel like they've been taken care of. But then they're also going to tell their friends and family about how they got it and their experiences there. And that can be a recruitment and outreach tool for people to come in and volunteer, but also possibly for services. If you're volunteering for 60 hours a week on a Habitat site, you're probably going to learn a little bit about the Habitat model, where it's not just giving away homes, it's not just giving away things to poor people, it's a partnership. There's a mortgage involved. Here are the things that you have to do to qualify for a Habitat home. Oh, I've met the families, they're like this, and what a wonderful thing that we can do to provide for these folks in this manner that is working with them, not working at them, or not necessarily working for them. So it's a great thing if you can get swag, even if it's just an event t-shirt, to hand out to your volunteers to keep them coming back and keep them talking about your organization. So a lot of faith communities exist in a lot of different places. I've grown up in a whole bunch of small towns, and there were probably 3 to 8 different churches. Even if it was literally a village where I grew up, there were probably 6 different churches of all different denominations. So a lot of folks are motivated by their faith to volunteer because of their faith, or they're motivated to volunteer with other people who share that faith. I know with AmeriCorps there are restrictions on religious education, evangelization, proselytization with faith-based volunteers. So if they want to minister to your volunteers as part of their, minister to your clients or the folks that you're serving as part of their volunteer service, be careful with that, because then that might violate that AmeriCorps prohibition on religiosity. Make sure that what they want to do as a faith community fits in with what you need them to do as a volunteer. If volunteering is not really in the works for folks in faith communities, they can also be a really great source of in-kind donations to your host site. They can also be a really great source of outreach and advocacy in the community to spread the word of your mission and services. So a lot of faith-based organizations or faith communities work with also low-income folks or populations in need. So if your host site organization provides a service that someone in their community or someone that they work with as part of their community needs to take advantage of, that partnership between you and that church, you and that mosque, you and that synagogue, that partnership can create an understanding of the services that you provide and create a bridge to your host site, to the folks that they work with, or the folks who are in that church who might need to take advantage of that service. Next slide. A lot of seniors want to keep active in their community. They've retired. Their family might not be close. They might not be able to get out and see their friends a whole lot. Older folks are really great with volunteering often because they want to stay active and they want to stay connected to their local area. Emphasize this when you're looking for volunteers. This is part of that relationship management, is meeting volunteers where they're at. If you're looking for someone who may be a little bit skilled or maybe very patient with your volunteers, or doesn't necessarily have to do a whole lot of active outside work, I know I'm stereotyping seniors a little bit here, make sure that you're promoting that, like, this is a desk job or this is a chance for socialization, because then you're getting folks who are looking for that aspect. If you're looking for someone who's very gregarious, very talkative, very great at outreach, you might have a senior or someone who's new to the community who is looking to get out there and just talk people's ear off, and you can train them how to talk about your organization and then send them out, and then they can talk up your services, they can talk up your host site organization, they can talk one-on-one with people in your community and make sure that you're serving them in that manner. Retirees may be willing to do a little bit more indirect work than a college student might, because that's something that they're used to. They also might have some professional skills that you can tap into, like teaching interview skills or basic typing, depending on what your host site offers as a service. If you're looking to recruit senior volunteers, there are a lot of programs and community organizations who know seniors who might want to volunteer. You can look for local senior centers, your local county office on aging. Faith centers and faith community have a lot of older folks in them, in my experience. Looking for independent living communities or nursing homes, and then partnering with other senior corps programs in your area might be very beneficial, because you've got that AmeriCorps partnership to kind of back yourself up on. So that's a great partnership, and CNCS and AmeriCorps always love to see that different AmeriCorps programs are partnering up with each other. So tapping into your local senior corps resources is a very great way to approach seniors as well. So some general tips to keep in mind with recruitment. Generational demographic approaches are very important. So not everyone has access to the internet, not everyone has computer skills. not everyone is physically able to do certain activities you might need done. I mean, I'm kind of a young adult, but I've got really weird knees, so me and gardening or me and heavy lifting aren't necessarily friends. But you might have some folks who want to volunteer because then that's their leg day or their arm day. That's their workout, is just moving heavy stuff around. Not everyone may be very comfortable with direct service, even if they have a heart to serve, especially coming in from a different community than the community that you're being served. They may need some transition time and some training on how to be comfortable and how to approach others from different backgrounds in a very caring and compassionate manner. So forcing them to do that or asking them to do that may not be the best choice for them, but that's something that you can build up with your relationship management skills, is making them comfortable or making sure that they have the skills and knowledge to directly serve or not directly serve, as the case may be. If you have a specific task or project in mind when you're recruiting volunteers, or if you communicate with your volunteer pool regularly to keep them updated on your future needs, that's going to be a very good engagement skill for you to build and for your volunteers to have advantage of. It's a really great thing for recruitment. It's a really great thing for retention, and it can be a great tool for recognition as well. If you don't communicate regularly with your volunteers, even if you don't have anything for them to do, your volunteers may fill their time elsewhere. One of my former members was having a big issue with volunteer retention because they didn't have a whole lot of projects. They weren't doing any active builds. So she worked with the teammates that she had at her host site organization and came up with smaller projects to keep volunteers occupied until there was a bigger project that could take more volunteers. So probably once a week, once every other week, she would send out an e-blast of, we need 10 or 12 volunteers to do landscaping maintenance on a Habitat Partners home or something like that, so that she could keep the volunteers who were really willing and ready to work, but she didn't really have anything big for them to do, kept them engaged, and it kept them centered in the organization. When you're working with especially vulnerable populations, make sure that sensitive or confidential information is shared only with qualified people, so probably other staff members or other volunteers who've gone through a clearance process. That might include stuff like social security numbers or credit history or criminal history. All of that is sensitive, privileged information that should only be shared with people who have the clearance to see it. That includes working with files or working directly with clients from vulnerable populations. So talking about retention. Retention is important, but also often overlooked. If you don't have regular projects that appeal to most of your volunteer base, how can you really make sure to keep them coming back? Like I said, communicate with them regularly. Have a volunteer newsletter. Have regular social media posts or email blasts for quick or immediate need projects. If you're kind of searching for projects and you're not really sure what to do, ask your volunteers for ideas. Maybe they see a need that you don't. Especially if your volunteer is from the community that you're serving, asking them what needs to be worked on is a really great way to make sure that you are both engaging your volunteers, but also engaging your community in an appropriate manner or in a manner that is actually necessary. If you're the one who's doing the majority of volunteer recruitment, but you're not actually necessarily out there in the community with your volunteers, get some ideas from your colleagues or the other folks at your host site, or maybe some other fellow members. As long as you're not recruiting for prohibited activities, go out and get those volunteers to serve around your host site as well. When you're engaging current volunteers and you're thinking about recognition, show them that you're appreciating them on a fairly regular basis. It doesn't have to be a very formal thing. It doesn't have to be a very big production. If you just hold a volunteer appreciation event, it can be like an ice cream sundae bar, an investment of maybe 25 or 50 bucks, depending on how many people you're anticipating, or a coffee and donut breakfast. You can come in and you can shake their hands, you can give them a card or something like that, and just show them how much you appreciate them on a very informal basis. You could also, as a bonus, use it as a recruitment event. Maybe add a raffle prize or something for volunteers who bring a friend to sign up to volunteer. Or maybe like a small gift bag, a keychain, or a pen, or something small to recognize your volunteers and then welcome new volunteers into your organization. If you have the ability, you could send your volunteers cards for milestones or important dates like birthdays or wedding anniversaries or something like that. I talked with someone else in volunteer management, and they had a gentleman who had been coming in for years and years and years, but then suddenly stopped. Come to find out, he had been in the hospital for a few weeks, so they sent him a card and flowers in his hospital room from the organization, thanking him for his service and wishing him a speedy recovery. And they heard from his wife, who almost broke down in tears on the phone to their volunteer manager, thanking them for approaching them and sending him that flowers, that gift, because the organization meant so much to the both of them that they were just so touched that they took the time, they took the effort to do that for him while he was in the hospital. So making sure that you're contacting your volunteers if you haven't heard from them in a while could be very important to your volunteer especially, but also to your organization. It can double as a check to make sure that their contact information is correct and their current volunteer waiver is on file as well. So volunteer assignments don't have to be complicated. They can be simple, recurring tasks that you delegate, like filing or making copies, so that you can spend a little bit more time doing something complex while an unskilled volunteer can get some hours in. This can also be a time for them to learn a little bit more about your mission and be trained to do something else as well. Volunteer assignments can be larger one-time projects for groups that also educates them about your mission and opens the opportunity for them to come back on their own. It might be a long-term project that you've had in the back of your head, but it's not really in your position description, so that you can kind of work with someone else on your team to create that position and pass it off to a volunteer. Volunteer assignments don't have to be regular. They don't have to be amazingly interesting, but they can still be beneficial on both sides. So I'm going to throw out some examples of volunteer projects that you might be able to take advantage of. I've sent the PowerPoint presentation to your Vista leader and to Maggie so that if you would like to have a copy of this for your own purposes to reference back with some ideas, you can have it. So if you're not really into taking notes very quickly, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to. If you've got an individual volunteer and you're kind of struggling with something for them to do, have the volunteer research resources and compile them for referrals for the folks that you serve. Especially if they're from the community that you're serving, they might know exactly who to go to if you're looking for something specific. So asking them to do that for you, you are engaging with the community that you're serving directly, but you're also compiling resources to make your service more sustainable and to be able to help more people in a more efficient manner. Your volunteer might be able to offer classes on basic skill sets. You can have your volunteers do outreach and marketing for those classes. You could ask your volunteers to sign up participants for those classes, and then assist with writing the curriculum, especially if they're more of a skilled volunteer. You could ask them to teach them as well. You could have volunteer mentors for clients who are receiving services from your organization. Bonus points if the mentors that you recruit are also former recipients, so they're very intimately familiar with the kind of work that your organization does, and they are very familiar with the process and procedures for receiving that service. And that can be a really great relationship that you are building with that mentor who is a former service recipient who can pass it on to a new service recipient. Volunteers can file, they can organize records, they can digitize files, they can go ahead and scan and then save those files onto a shared drive if they have that kind of permission and access. You can have volunteers handle your social media if you trust them with that. You could have digital volunteers do that as well, handle your social media. Or you could have digital volunteers make flyers or handouts for your organization. That's kind of a newer trend with volunteering, is that your volunteers don't have to be in the office or even located in the same country as the community that you're serving. You could have them do this virtually as long as you're communicating with them regularly about the kind of stuff that you need. Some examples for volunteer groups. Small groups or individuals as well can canvass neighborhoods to talk about talk to potential recipients of your services, making sure that they understand what all that they can receive from your organization and the benefits that they can receive from those services. Groups can also do outreach efforts to or with their affinity groups. If you have a faith group that wants to come out and volunteer, they can do an outreach event for your organization. Civic groups like Rotary or Kiwanis, sports groups, hobby groups like a knitting group or a sewing circle, something like that. Volunteer groups could put on workshops or informational panels. These groups can not only plan and implement those for you, but they can also do a lot of planning and curriculum building so that these workshops are sustainable after this one-time event or after your service is done. If you're working with a big group of people who might not want to do more intensive work, or it's just like a one-time project with a college or a high school group, there's probably some sort of big clean inside or outside that groups can do in a few hours. They can do some landscaping, they can do some yard raking, and then rack up some of those service hours. So I want to relate this back to the VISTA mission so that you guys have an idea of why volunteering is important, but also why volunteer management is important to working with communities in need and working to eliminate poverty. Volunteers should be inspired to serve. It shouldn't be something that they have to drag their feet to do, even though you're probably going to get some of those anyway. Serving the community means that you're working with the community towards a goal that the community determines, not working at them from a goal that an outsider thinks is best. That's why recruiting volunteers from within the community is very important, so that you're actually impacting the community that you're working with in a way that actually works for the community. Recruiting volunteers from the community means you serve often means that they will be well acquainted with the needs, but also the resources that the community can offer. Sustainable solutions to ending poverty cannot be dictated from the outside. They have to have community input and buy-in to succeed. If you are working at a community and telling the community what it needs, the community will not really progress. Educating volunteers from outside the community is important to make sure that they are understanding the intricacies of the community that they serve and not just the stereotypes about that community. And then once those volunteers are educated and understanding of the situation that actually exists, they can use that experience to educate others, whether that's educating others to further that impact, educating others to bring more volunteers in, or educating others to continue a change that is being made. Other community members in their community that they came from, or people up the line who have the power to really make a lasting change in the legislature or in local government, or the people who hold the purse strings. So I think that's the end of our presentation, and I'm sorry I've run a little bit long. So I'm going to hand the webinar back over to the folks at M&A to talk a little bit more about your feedback and about your issues that you might be facing with volunteers, or how that relates back to the VISTA mission. Thank you so much. And if you would like to contact me about volunteer management or with working with other AmeriCorps programs in your area through AmeriCorps State, please let me know. I will also be at your IST training at the end of November.
Hey, Bridget, do you have time for a couple questions?
Definitely.
Okay, perfect. So the first question we have is from Ben, and he said, do you find a higher success rate recruiting volunteers for one-time events or for recurring events?
Oh, it really depends. It depends a lot on the event that you're trying to hold. and it depends on the type of people that you're recruiting. So if you're recruiting from like a college group or something like that, and it's just a one-time event, that's going to be very easy recruitment because they can just clear a Saturday and it's a one-time thing, and then they feel good, and then they can go home and continue whatever they're doing. If you're recruiting for a recurring event, you are probably going to want to recruit from people who want to keep coming back, or for events that are related to each other. So if you're holding a series of workshops, you're going to want to recruit for people who are willing to and able to do that. So it really depends on the kind of folks who you want to come in and volunteer with you and the kind of content that you're holding for a recurring event. There are pros and cons to each, as with everything. A one-time event is very easy to put on. You don't necessarily have to plan for a long-term thing. It's kind of a one-and-done thing, and that's what some people are looking for. But if you have someone who really wants to come in and has the skills to come in, it'll probably take a little bit more planning on your part as far as retention and relationship building. But you can still get a lot of volunteers who want to come back for a recurring event.
Thank you. And then just one more. Nia says, I'm working with Heart of West Michigan United Way. How much swag is the right amount for students? Unlike company campaigns, students don't bring in more revenue. So at what point is giving away swag cost inefficient, and when is it efficient?
That probably is part of a larger conversation with your host site and with United Way, the people who hold the purse strings. You're right, though, that college students aren't necessarily like the big donors where it would be cost efficient to continue giving them swag. But that doesn't mean that cultivating a volunteer and a college student isn't cultivating a future donor when they get a little bit more financially secure after they graduate from college, or if they come into some money. So I would say keeping it simple with college students, especially because college student is kind of a transitory part of their life. You don't necessarily need to give them a bunch of stuff, but you could give them smaller, useful things. Like college students always need pens. College students always love t-shirts. College students really look for, in my experience, useful things for their lifestyle. So you might not necessarily need to give them like all of the keychains, because you can only get so many keychains. And my grandmother gave me an entire bag of keychains, and I was like, what am I going to do with this? So you don't necessarily need to give them all the swag at every event every time. But especially if they're a recurring volunteer as a college student, a t-shirt is fantastic. If it's a big event, a t-shirt would really work. But then if it's just like a one-time thing, you can probably print up some stuff fairly cheaply, or work with a local organization or a local company to get some swag printed really cheaply. And that could also be a relationship that you work with your colleagues at your host site to build, is getting stuff donated or donated at a discount from a local printer. Everyone loves water bottles. Everyone needs pens. So if you keep it simple with volunteers who might not be in a donor cultivation kind of mindset, if you keep it to reusable items or very useful items, or items that can be doubled as a marketing tool like a t-shirt, that probably will not go into the cost inefficient level, and it will still be something that you can use to recognize your volunteers, to thank your volunteers, and it will be useful as a marketing and recruitment tool for your organization, where you can get other volunteers in that might double as donors down the line. So yeah, keep it simple. It doesn't have to be for every event. It doesn't have to be for every time they volunteer. It can be something reusable like a water bottle or a t-shirt.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we have, but I really appreciate you presenting for us today, and I really think a lot of this information is invaluable to our visitors during their year of service. Thanks, Bridget.
Not a problem. thank you guys for listening to me, and I'll be at the IST in November talking about coaching strategies for volunteers if you kind of want a little bit more in-depth talking about working with volunteers.
Thank you. Bye, Bridget.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, guys, we are going to skip the poverty discussion for this month, and we are going to pick up with it next month, so don't look at those questions. Okay. And then we're just going to go over some housekeeping, and then get you out of here. I know we're running a little bit late, but we're going to speed through it. And
yep, this will only take a minute. So, hi, it's Maggie, and I'm back, and if your timesheets haven't been turned in yet, please turn them in ASAP. I've heard from Zakia. Zakia only has one person who hasn't turned theirs in yet, and Mary, I don't know where you were with
I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
I'll have to take a better count.
So you might not get in trouble if you send yours to Mary, like, right now. And then upcoming regional trainings. Tomorrow we get to see a bunch of people in Lansing, and then in a month we'll get to see people in Detroit, and we're really looking forward to that. And then your QPR is due in 10 days. So hopefully you've started working on it. I think, has the link been sent out?
So you guys all should have gotten your template about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and then the template, so the template was sent out, and then the link was sent out on October 19th. So if you can't find it, go into your inbox and look for October 19th. If you still can't, email one of us, and we'll send you another link.
Okay. And just as a reminder, you do need to go over what you're submitting for your QPR prior to submitting it. You need to go over it with your supervisor before you send it in to us. And please, if you haven't already, tell your VISTA leaders what you want for lunch during your site visit, so that way we can make sure to order it for you and make sure that you have food to eat during that time. And this is my little baby that I had. Her name's Evelyn Jane, and she was born September 14th, and she's really squishy and cuddly. I really like her a lot.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's good.
Yeah, it's turning out well.
So you guys are good to go. We're going to save the poverty discussion for next month. We'll stay on for a couple minutes in case you have any questions about your QPR or regional trainings or anything like that. But y'all can head out now if you want to.
Make it a great day.
Yep.
Wednesday. Woo!